Hello and welcome to another episode of Spiritually Incorrect. On this episode we have Smacking J.R.R. Tolkien. Was C.S. Lewis a covert Catholic? And Gimli's secret identity. I'm your host Seth Hart. Joined with me is Jonathan Lionheart.
Hello, friend.
Hello. Happy birthday to you, friend.
Thank you. It is my birthday, or it's the hours after my birthday. It's the day after.
111th birthday.
111th birthday. Yes, I'm 35 now. Yes, so
all these obscure Tolkien references. I hope people have seen the movies recently.
Yeah. So
the good movies, not War of the Rohirrim.
Well, I still liked it. I just was disappointed in some of the stuff they did in War of the Rohirrim.
Yeah. We'll get into that in the post discussion, I guess. Anyway, John, what'd you get for your birthday?
This is funny because it's totally fitting. I got the Alan Lee illustrated editions of Hobbit and the trilogy, and I got a a toy of Sauron leaning over everyone that I'm going to put on my wall in my office. And I also got a Christmas sweater of the Balrog attacking Gandalf. So
that's actually amazing. I want a Christmas. Yeah. I think I've seen this Christmas sweater because let's be honest, top 10 most epic moments in movie history.
Yeah, that you wanna beat that? Go higher on the list than that? Nope, you shall not pass that point on the list. It is the list.
Although I will say, I think Jurassic Park, the T-Rex, the initial T-Rex scene in the Jeeps, that to me is peak cinema. As far as like that fear, awe factor with like a movie monster or whatever. That to me, that and the Balrog scene, I think are top 2.
Yeah, no, it's. I guess Jurassic Park's okay.
Oh, comparatively. Give me a break. Okay, what else? What else would be up there then for you?
I don't know. You're putting me on the spot here. So
you are the movie expert. If I ask you, what year did the Fellowship of the Ring come out?
2001.
Yeah,
everyone knows that though. Everyone knows that year.
No, they don't.
Yeah, they do.
Everyone knows that year. Oh, sure, but no one. Yeah, but when it comes to like movie monsters, like you can't think of anything.
The best movie monster moments specifically?
Yeah, like something analogous to the Balrog scene.
I don't know, man.
Boo. Typical. Well, maybe we should have asked Professor Ward when he was on here. John, tell us a little bit about Michael Ward.
Well, super excited that we got Professor Michael Ward on here today.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you're the connection to him. He studied at Oxford, Cambridge, St. Andrews, and he is now associate professor in theology and religion at Oxford University, and he's also a professor at Houston Christian University. He has published widely, including the incredibly well-known book Planet Narnia, which many of you might have read if you're Lewis and Tolkien fans. And
it was considered groundbreaking and completely redefined how we understand the Narnia series.
Yes. We're super excited we got him on here because he's one of the most important living Lewis scholars.
Probably him and McGrath, Alistair McGrath are probably the two biggest ones. And they're colleagues, which is hilarious.
Yeah. And that's just one of his books. He's got multiple books out there, including After Humanity, Popcorn with the Pope, and the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis, and he's even been in a few movies. He's made people bring him on to have cameos in their Lewis and Tolkien movies. So, like in the 2021 film, The Most Reluctant Convert, he plays Lewis's vicar in one of the scenes there. So he's made it into a bunch of the Lewis movies here and there as a side guy.
I chuckled when I saw that movie, and there he is, and I remember just like hanging out and talking to him, and there he is in a movie I'm watching.
Yeah,
it was a great moment that made me feel slightly famous.
It's the best claim that we have. We know people who are in movies about other people who are famous. That's as close as we get to glory, Seth.
Soon, John, soon. The Spiritually Incorrect podcast. One day we will have Oxford professors playing us in movies.
There we go. So that's the goal. Is fame, glory, women. I mean, I've already got a woman, your sister. This is weird now. But
Want want. Well, in that movie, I hope we do have a monster scene as well, and maybe that actually might make your top 10, John.
well, thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Ward. Could you just start off by telling us a bit about yourself and your work?
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me. About myself, I am Michael Ward. I'm speaking to you from Oxford, England, where I live and work and have done most of my adult life. I'm a C.S. Lewis scholar. I did my PhD on C.S. Lewis's theological imagination. And I've written extensively on Lewis and a little bit on Tolkien and Chesterton. What else do you want to know?
And yeah,
Well, what led you to be interested in the Inklings and Lewis and Tolkien? What's the journey of you to their journey?
I was introduced to C.S. Lewis as a kid, like I suppose many people are, when my parents read the Narnia books to me. But I didn't just stop with Narnia. I went on to Lewis's other fiction, the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce. I got into his apologetics, went through all his apologetic works in my teenage years. Then I came here to Oxford to do my undergraduate in English, and for the first time studied Lewis more formally for an undergraduate paper that I was having to write. And as a result of that, after I graduated, I was asked to do a bit of tutoring and lecturing on Lewis, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more, and it sort of snowballed into something of an unintended career in Lewis, and I ended up living in his house, the Kilns. I had his bedroom as my bedroom for 3 years, and his study as my study. And it was all unplanned. I was just, as it were, following my nose. I liked Lewis and found I was quite good at analysing his works. And so when it came time for me to do my PhD, Lewis was the obvious choice because I was already fairly expert in him. And then in the course of my doctoral researches, I stumbled across what I believe to be the inner imaginative structure of the Narnia Chronicles, which became my first book, Planet Narnia. Perhaps we'll talk about that. At any rate, Lewis has become for me the focus of my life's work, I suppose, without ever it being a sort of calculated, deliberated ambition. I just liked it, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to study him because he's endlessly fascinating, and he brings you into other fascinating writers like Tolkien, but really everybody, because Lewis read everything and remembered everything. To study C.S. Lewis is an education in itself.
What was it like to be thinking about Lewis and researching Lewis while living in his bedroom? Did it feel like with every word you wrote, he was sort of over your shoulder, like, oh, I wouldn't say that? Or did it feel like he was really present there in some sort of weird way? Or is that too occult sounding?
Did his ghost ever appear to you?
I never sensed his direct presence. I remember when I was really deep in my PhD, that I went out to a pub one evening with a friend, and I had spent so much of that day and that week and that month immersed in Lewis's habits of thought and ways of speaking that as I was chatting to this friend, I suddenly noticed that I was sort of channeling C.S. Lewis, and I was sort of speaking in his manner and his voice. It wasn't conscious. It was weird. And I quickly stopped that. But when I was living in the Kilns, no, the closest I got to a sort of shivery kind of moment of presence, as it were, was when I was sitting in his study one afternoon. I was listening to the radio. BBC Radio were putting out an adaptation of one of the Narnia books, The Silver Chair, which was enjoyable, and I was listening to it, and then it suddenly hit me between the eyeballs that that very book had been written in the room where I was sitting. And Lewis had, composed this book. He got it published. It was sent out into the world. It was successful. It achieved something like a canonical status. It was adapted for the radio. It was beamed back into the room many decades later. And I just happened to be there when the circle was completed. And that felt very weird, but in a good way. It was a special moment.
And your interest isn't just with C.S. Lewis, right? It's also shifted also to J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yes, somewhat. I mean, I'm never going to be an expert in Tolkien the way that I think I can claim to be in Lewis, because, you just steep yourself so much in your doctoral subject, don't you? And that it's very hard to replicate that with subsequent areas of study. In any case, there are aspects of Tolkieniana that I'm never going to be, remotely qualified to get into. All his philological language creation stuff. I'm never going to get there, so I'm not even going to try. But yes, I have increasingly in recent years looked into Tolkien. I'm actually rather proud of one of the things I've written on Tolkien. It's about the field of Cormallen, the climax of the Lord of the Rings. That's Tolkien's own description of that episode when the two hobbits are praised on the field of Cormallen. But what I discovered was that Cormallen means a field where a ring of golden trees grow. A ring of golden trees. Nobody had not spotted this before. Nobody had bothered to unpack this before. But I think it's highly significant and interesting that, after destroying the evil ring, the ring of power that corrupts people, the two hobbits find their way into a natural ring, a ring of golden trees, and that's where the climax of the whole epic is set. But you don't know this. You can't work this out from anything that Tolkien says in The Lord of the Rings, because the meaning of the word Cormallen is hidden in the appendices of the Silmarillion. So why Tolkien should have buried that inner meaning so deep is itself very interesting to me. And anyway, if people want to read my piece on that, it's available online in An Unexpected Journal.
That's interesting. So you're basically correlating this new ring, this natural ring, versus the sort of quite unnatural, corrupted ring of Sauron.
Yes. And we know that everybody knows Tolkien loved trees. The Ents and Treebeard, and just in real life too, he had a passion for trees. He had a special passion for golden trees, laburnums, which you can trace back to his undergraduate days. And then he positions these trees not just randomly on this field, but deliberately in a ring, but doesn't tell anybody what he's up to. And it's fascinating to me that he should hide his intent so thoroughly. And I think that speaks to quite a lot of Tolkien's imaginative creativity, that he didn't want to make everything obvious. And C.S. Lewis likewise. There's a lot of hiddenness in Lewis. It speaks to their view of the universe, the real universe, as endlessly meaningful and sacramentally significant. You can't easily get to the end of the universe because it is a bearer of divine meanings, which will never be exhausted by human inquiry. And so there's a kind of correlative of that in their fiction.
So just as heaven's kind of further up and further in, this indefinite thing that's never fully reached, it's almost like the universe itself is further down and further into the universe. You're never going to exhaust it.
Well, maybe not down.
Well, but I mean, not to hell, but I mean down on the earthly plane. Even Earth and the trees and all of that just keep going. And as soon as you think you've figured them out and labeled it, they surprise you.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, of course, there are limits to what any mere human artist can achieve, even in a work as massive and sprawling as Middle-earth. But nonetheless, in principle, what you say is absolutely right. That's what they're trying to achieve imaginatively. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, and thank you for giving us this transition of your work from Lewis to Tolkien. Could you maybe tell us a bit about Lewis and Tolkien's friendship and their relationship itself? Help guide our audience who might not already know that these guys were friends and what that friendship was and the sort of arc of how that evolved. Could you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, they were very close friends and indeed, of course, colleagues here at Oxford. They met in 1926, I believe. At least that's the first record of their meeting. Lewis writes about it in his diary and says that he's encountered Tolkien at an English faculty meeting, describes him as a pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. And that's a rather sort of inauspicious first encounter. But fairly soon after that, they did begin to be friends. And this is before Lewis was a Christian or even a theist. But they found that they had a lot of interests in common as English literary scholars, especially their interest in myth and in Icelandic and Norse mythology. Especially, they were members together of a group called the Coalbiters, which was a group Tolkien set up to teach his colleagues Old Icelandic. Anyway, what really led to their friendship becoming so crucially mutually influential for them was Lewis's conversion to Christianity, which was brought about in no small part because of a conversation that Lewis had with Tolkien and with a third friend called Hugo Dyson in 1931, when Tolkien and Dyson, who were already Christians, said to Lewis, think of Christianity somewhat as you think about mythology, as you have grown up enjoying pagan myths of dying and rising gods. But with the pagan myths, you have been content to rest in the story. You have not tried to translate the story into a set of doctrines or concepts or theological formulations. Whereas with Christianity, that is what you are trying to do. You're trying to turn Christianity, the narrative of Christianity, into a system of thought, creedal formulations and concepts. But as they showed Lewis, concepts and ideas, that though valuable, are merely translations from a richer language into a poorer language. That the language most adequate for understanding Christianity is the lived language, the language of a real man in a real time, in a real place, doing real things. Jesus of Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, crucified under Pontius Pilate. All these concrete and dramatic and situated realities. And here in Jesus Christ, we have the true dying and rising God. We have Christ, as it were, describing the same trajectory down and up into death and into new life, just as Balder and Adonis and Bacchus and the corn gods describe a similar descent and reascent, betokening new life in the crops, or the coming of spring, or the coming of the sunrise each morning. Pagan myths are men's myths. That is to say, they are the result of human imaginative engagements with God's creation. Christianity is God's myth. That is to say, it is God expressing himself to us through real things, through real people in real times and real places. And that is why it's the true myth. It has all the qualities of a myth in terms of the descent and the reascent, but it has also a good claim to being historical. And once Lewis thought, oh yeah, I can appreciate Christianity principally, or I ought at any rate to appreciate Christianity principally as a story with my imagination, and only secondarily start turning it into a system of doctrines and concepts and formulations. That was a huge breakthrough for him, because until that point he'd been getting Christianity back to front, as it were. He'd been over intellectualizing Christianity. But the deepest form of communication is story, not system. That's basically what Tolkien and Dyson showed Lewis. And that was a great breakthrough for him. Soon afterwards, he described himself as a Christian. He said Tolkien and Dyson provided him with the last bit of help to get him over the final obstacle. And after that, of course, Lewis and Tolkien had, all the more reason to be friends. And it was largely through Lewis's endless encouragement that Tolkien wrote and completed and offered for publication The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien says as much in a number of letters, that if it hadn't been for Lewis's encouragement taken at points of time to nagging, to putting the screw on me, Tolkien said, to get the damn thing done, he would never have finished what is now regularly voted the greatest work of literature of the 20th century. So in a sense, Lewis repaid Tolkien, obviously not to the same extent, because writing a great work of literature can't be equated with one's Christian salvation, but it's perhaps the next best thing. And yeah, without Lewis, Tolkien would not have completed and written The Lord of the Rings.
You mentioned that Tolkien described Christianity as a true myth. And I didn't want that to escape our audience real quick, because when we hear the word myth, we tend to think fake. And so you hear the words true myth, it sounds like an oxymoron, like a jumbo shrimp or something like that. Can you explain a little bit about what is meant by myth here?
Yes, you're quite right. Myth is often heard these days as a story which is necessarily false. It might be simpler and less misleading just to use the word story. A true story, or the true story. We tend to be a bit less suspicious about the word story. And we recognize that stories can be bearers of great truths. We talk about our own personal story, don't we? We tend not to talk about our own personal myth, but that's basically what Lewis and Tolkien mean by myth. A story, a narrative, a drama, a sequence of events happening to characters. And it's within that mode of communication that God reveals himself to us. I mean, principally, of course, in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, but of course, the incarnation is itself only a subset of the grand story of salvation history, stretching from Genesis to Revelation. So that's basically how we should hear the word myth: story, narrative, drama.
Gotcha. And during this conversion, Tolkien was Catholic. Had he hoped Lewis would also become Catholic?
Presumably. I don't think there's any actual evidence, documentary evidence of him saying that or writing that. But I think we can assume it, because, Tolkien wanted everybody to become Catholic. But I don't know that he ever seriously expected Lewis to become a Catholic. He knew that Lewis had been raised in the Anglican fold. Lewis's grandfather had been an Anglican clergyman. Lewis had been, thoroughly anglicized in that religious sense. And I think Tolkien was just happy that Lewis had found belief in Jesus Christ. He says as much, that he's, delighted that after a long pilgrimage, Lewis is now a lover of our Lord. Whether he seriously ever, tried to proselytize Lewis, we don't know. There's no accounting of that. The most interesting little nugget I have for you on that subject is after Lewis died in 1963, Tolkien wrote to a friend of theirs, a mutual friend, who was, as it happens, a Catholic, like Tolkien. And Tolkien said to this correspondent, George Sayer, within a week of Lewis's death, it will be great that Lewis is now experiencing, we hope, we trust, in heaven, all those things that he was doubtful or skeptical about on earth. He will at last be encountering our Lord's mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary. the Queen of Heaven. And then Tolkien adds, in my own way, in a very remote fashion, that is an ingredient in Gimli's love for Galadriel. So you remember in the Lord of the Rings that Gimli, who is very suspicious about the elves, falls completely head over heels in love with the beauty of Galadriel and asks that the only thing he asks from her as a gift is a strand of her hair, and she gives him 3. And this for him is the most priceless gift imaginable, after all his hesitations and suspicions about those wicked elves. And according to Tolkien, at some distant level, as he was constructing that episode, he had Lewis and Mary in mind. I mean, it's not an allegory. He's not saying that. But in a remote fashion, there's an aspect of it going on.
That's so interesting because, I mean, aren't the dwarfs originally a creation that weren't meant to be made? You know, they weren't part of the original plan in the Silmarillion, but then they get created almost against the original design plan. And so they might not have been the original plan in the way that I imagine Tolkien might have seen the Catholic Church as the original plan, but they still can kind of live and come closer to the Creator. Could there be a parallel at a deeper level with Protestants and Catholics where the dwarves are almost, okay, this isn't how it was supposed to be, but Protestants and dwarves still can kind of, in the end, come back around? Or is that taking it too far?
I suspect that's taking it a bit too far.
Okay.
I don't know enough about the origins of the dwarves to speak to the point you're making. And it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, that Tolkien himself was raised an Anglican. You know, his first 8 years, I think, or so, were spent in the Anglican fold. So it's not. People often think that Tolkien was a lifelong Catholic, and he wasn't. He crossed the Tiber with his mother when she became a Catholic. As I say, when he was about 8, something like that. So Tolkien understood Anglicanism very well. He wasn't prejudiced against it. He grew up in an Anglican culture. That's what England is still. Our head of state, the king, is the supreme governor of the Church of England and cannot be a Catholic. I don't know if you noticed, if you watched the coronation of our new king, Charles, last May, that one of the things he had to swear before he was crowned was that he was going to uphold the Protestant settlement of the Church of England. In a way, Tolkien, for all that he's regarded as you might say an establishment figure, an Oxford figure, an archetypally English figure, because of his Catholicism, was to a certain extent at odds with the English establishment.
All I'm going to take away from this conversation is now every time I watch Lord of the Rings, I'm going to see Gimli as C.S. Lewis. John, did you want to follow up?
Well, I was wondering, do you see this, with Lewis becoming a Christian through the Catholic trajectory of Tolkien? I'm wondering, do you see strands of specifically Catholic stuff coming out in Lewis? And what aspects of Lewis's thought did he see as distinguishing him from being Catholic? And so I guess the question is, in what ways is Lewis sort of Catholic, but also in what ways is he separating himself from that? And how can we see that play out in his work?
And can I also add to that, did he ever entertain becoming Catholic? Is there any evidence of that?
Yeah. Well, Lewis had been raised in quite a Protestant form of Anglicanism. His grandfather, as I say, had been a clergyman of the Church of England or Church of Ireland, and was quite anti-Catholic. And Lewis's own nurse, his nursemaid when he was a little boy, was also ferociously anti-Catholic. When she took him out on a wet day for a walk in the park and he wanted to splash in the puddles, she said, No, Master Jacks, don't splash in those puddles. There are dirty wee popes in those puddles. Um, and of course, the north of England, north of Ireland, where Lewis was raised, was then, and to a certain extent still is, one of the most sectarianly divided places on the planet. I mean, it's much less bad than it used to be in terms of that sort of apartheid between Catholics and Protestants, but it's still evident to a certain extent. And it's hard to put ourselves back into that mindset of how Lewis was raised, to be incredibly suspicious of Catholics. Indeed, he says this in Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, that he says, when I first came into the world, I was warned explicitly never to trust a Catholic or a papist. And when I came into the English faculty at Oxford, I was warned implicitly never to trust a philologist. Tolkien was both. And so the fact that they became such firm friends indicates the extent to which Lewis overcame a lot of those sort of inbred conditioning anti-Catholic impulses. And Lewis became a very Catholic-friendly kind of Anglican in many respects. He believed in purgatory. He went to confession. He talked about the Blessed Sacrament. He had a high view of the priesthood and regarded it as a male-only vocation. He had great doubts about the morality of contraception. He had a high view of certain relics, like the Turin shroud. He had a picture of the face on the Turin shroud framed in his bedroom. And many other things. He fasted on Fridays, for instance. He prayed for the dead. So in all those respects, he was, very much on the Catholic-facing frontier of Anglicanism. But this is where we come back to Seth's question about whether he seriously entertained becoming a Catholic. He never came close, I think, to adopting a Catholic view of either the Pope or of Mary. And indeed, he describes Catholic attitudes to those two subjects as heresies. So I don't think he was ever close to becoming a Catholic, in fact, for all his Catholic inclinations.
That's interesting, because the last conversation I had with Walter Hooper, his secretary, he had said that he thought that if Lewis was alive today, he would be Catholic. Though Hooper himself is Catholic, so I don't know how much of that was just him sort of hoping that would be true. But that stuck with me, and I was always curious about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows? I mean, Walter Hooper may have been right. It's purely hypothetical. Nobody really knows. I think there was an element of wishful thinking on Walter's part when he said that, and possibly a slight confusion of two things, because I think it's a fairly easy statement to make, or at any rate, it's much more plausible to argue that Lewis would have ceased to be an Anglican if he had lived for another 40 years, like his friend Owen Barfield did. That is to say, if Lewis had retained all the beliefs that we know that he held during his life, he would have had a difficult job remaining an Anglican, given all the changes that have happened in Anglicanism. But to cease to be an Anglican is not to become a Catholic. And that's I think the jump that Walter perhaps was making in logic when he said that to you, and he said it to me many times. But in a way, it's a slightly improper conversation to be having, because I mean, it's not for us to say what anybody else should have done or would have done or might have done. Who are we to judge another's servant? We have only one soul that we're responsible for, and that's our own. And it's none of our business what anybody else happens to choose to do or not do.
To clarify, we're not Catholic. If it came off that we were secretly trying to slip Lewis in to baptize him posthumously, we're not. We're just interested in the relationship between Lewis and Tolkien.
If Tolkien was right, then Lewis is Catholic right now. So there you go.
Well, exactly. Yeah, and I mean that is indeed a good way of thinking about it, that Catholics view their Protestant brothers and sisters as what they call separated brethren. They are brothers and sisters in Christ because we have the same baptism. And so to that extent, Tolkien would have viewed Lewis as a Catholic at root, but just not enjoying the fullness of communion with the Catholic Church that he might have done.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you giving us the background here so that we can understand what both of them had to overcome in order to meet somewhere in the middle, especially because this is before Vatican II, right? We're looking in hindsight and imagining the relationship in light of Catholic Protestant relations today. But, this is
Absolutely.
before Vatican II. Well,
yes,
but maybe... Go ahead.
And not just before, sorry to interrupt, and not just before Vatican II, but also before the pontificate of John Paul II. I think John Paul II was a very transformative pope for a lot of Anglicans and Protestants generally, because he had such a winsome fashion manner and an evangelical spirit, was so evidently a godly man. I think a lot of Protestant Catholic relations nowadays are the result of not just Vatican II, but John Paul II. And interestingly, John Paul II greatly admired Lewis's book, The Four Loves. And Seth, you probably heard Walter Hooper say this. Hooper once met John Paul II at a papal audience in Rome, and the Pope said to Hooper, you're the C.S. Lewis scholar. Yes, C.S. Lewis, a great man. He had an apostolate from the Lord, and he did it.
I do remember that.
Yeah, Walter was very fond of telling that story. Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict XVI, also greatly admired Lewis's The Abolition of Man. So Tolkien sometimes regretted that Lewis's Irish upbringing was preventing him from seeing things clearly, and he talked not about the ulterior motive, but the ulsterior motive. Nice pun, because Lewis was raised in Ulster, province of Ulster. There was an ulterior motive for Lewis not becoming a Catholic, and indeed, there's an account of Lewis in a correspondence, which alas hasn't survived, but allegedly Lewis told a Catholic priest in correspondence that he often prayed for that he would overcome the prejudices instilled in him by his Ulster nurse. But he was never granted that particular insight, and so I think he followed the light that he was given, and I'm glad that he did.
So pivoting away a little bit from this question, I want to talk about something, a little nugget you dropped earlier, which is the background to C.S. Lewis's works in Narnia, and that was the subject of your first book, having to do with like astrology and the planets and stuff. Can you give us a brief overview?
There are 7 Chronicles of Narnia because there are 7 heavens in the medieval cosmos. That's the thing in a nutshell. The 7 heavens are best understood if you think about the names of the days of the week. Saturday is Saturn's day. Sunday is the day of the sun. Monday is the day of the moon. The sun and the moon were regarded as planets back in the Middle Ages. And in addition to Saturn, the sun and the moon, you have Mars, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter. Mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi in French. Or martes, miércoles, jueves, and viernes in Spanish. So every day of our lives, we're actually referring to this old heptarchical system of the 7 heavens. And Lewis, being such a learned medievalist, studied very closely how the 7 heavens were understood and used symbolically in poetry and art and indeed music, and described them as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. And he writes about this extensively in his academic writings, such as The Discarded Image. He also writes about it extensively in his poetry. His poetry is probably the least well-known part of his output as a writer, but he wrote a long poem called The Planets in 1935, detailing all these influences and attributes that each planet was believed to have had. And of course, he also uses it extensively in his fiction, in the Ransom trilogy, that trilogy of interplanetary novels that he wrote, where again, the first book is set on Mars, a very medieval Mars. The second book is set on Venus, very medieval Venus, and the third book features some of the 5 of the 7 planets coming down to Earth and, as it were, exerting their influences very palpably on the characters in that story. So in all these different places, his academic writings, his poetry, his earlier fiction, Lewis is deploying and investigating the symbolic uses of these 7 spiritual symbols. When he comes to write Narnia, I believe he uses them again, but this time implicitly, secretly. He doesn't make it obvious, but he's using as his kind of imaginative blueprint one of the planets for each of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. So The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the kingly, Jupiter, jovial story. The Prince Caspian is the martial story about knights and chivalry. The Dawn Treader is the sun story about a journey towards the place of the rising sun. The Silver Chair is the moon story about wetness and wanderings and lunacy, and so on and so forth. And in each book, Aslan embodies, you might say incarnates, the characteristics of the prevailing planetary spirit, which are also felt in the wider story and in the way that the children interact with Aslan. So it's a way for Lewis, I think, to give each story a kind of internal symbolic logic, and also a beautiful way of showing how the Christian life involves taking on the characteristics of Jesus Christ, this idea of theosis, of divinization. So when, for instance, at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the children start drinking the sea, and we're told it's more like drinking light than it is like drinking water. And they can stare with their eagle's eyes straight into the center of the sun. They're becoming solar, as it were. They're becoming sun-like. They're becoming like Aslan, who is the true sun in that book. He's, like Jesus says in John's Gospel, I am the light of the world. All this astrological imagery is fully compatible with scriptural imagery. And that's worth emphasizing, because some people, on hearing the word astrology, their hair goes on fire and they think, but astrology is occult and wicked. How could Lewis have been interested in that? But of course, there's a long tradition of Christian astrology, most notably, of course, in Matthew's Gospel, the wise men from the east follow the star to Bethlehem. But what are these probably Babylonian figures but astrologers? They're looking at the stars, they're reading the spiritual significance of the stars, and it's leading them to worship Christ. Lewis was very fond of Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. He describes Psalm 19 as the greatest poem in the Psalter, one of the greatest lyrics in the world. And it's that kind of Christian scriptural understanding of the stars as spiritually significant things that he's using to give his Narnia books their internal structure.
Well, that's a really great background on Lewis as a medievalist and also as a theologian, and those things coming together in what he creates. But you've also talked a lot about Lewis as a philosopher. You have a book called After Humanity, in which you focus on Lewis as a philosophical thinker in his own right. Could you maybe tell us a bit about what was unique and interesting about Lewis's philosophy? We hear a lot about his theology, but what's unique about his philosophy and him as a philosopher?
Well, probably nothing is unique, and he wouldn't have wanted it to be unique. Indeed, one of Lewis's strengths, I think, as an apologist for Christianity and as a thinker in general, is that he rather deliberately tried to focus on broad central mainstream of doctrine when it comes to Christianity and of thought generally when it comes to philosophy. He's just wanting to restate the primeval platitudes. There's nothing new under the sun, as we know from the book of Ecclesiastes. And the desire for sort of novelty is a terrible curse on academics. That's one of the reasons why Lewis didn't bother necessarily to read every latest book that came out. Why should I read a book just because it happens to have been published in the last year? It doesn't mean it's any good. He was strongly opposed to what he called chronological snobbery, the idea that things that are old are necessarily therefore less valuable. Well, that doesn't follow at all. You've got to show why it is that they're no longer current. Have they dropped out of the picture because they've been disproved, or have they just gone out of fashion? But anyway, to speak to the substance of your question, Lewis's most philosophical book was The Abolition of Man, a short but very dense work on ethics, really, and on the question of whether value is objective or subjective. And these this short work is based on 3 lectures that Lewis gave at the University of Durham. Shout out for Durham, Seth.
We need some representation.
Exactly. Lewis went up to Durham to give these 3 lectures on successive nights in February 1943. And the book has become a classic. It's much admired by people all across the religious spectrum, and indeed by non-believers. It's not a work of apologetics. It's not a theological work. It's a purely philosophical work. And so, for instance, there's a contemporary British philosopher called John Gray, who describes himself as an atheist, who nonetheless regards the abolition of man very highly and recently broadcast about it on the BBC, saying how prescient and prophetic Lewis was in his description of subjectivist habits of mind, and how things that Lewis saw developing in the 1930s and 40s in this area about imposing value upon reality as opposed to discovering value in reality, those trends have only increased and deepened over the decades since Lewis wrote. So that now we often describe our contemporary situation as a post-truth world. You have your truth, I have my truth, but there is no such thing as the truth, is there? And it would be disastrous if there were, because then you would impose that upon me, wouldn't you? But, well, of course not. That's the whole point. That if there is the truth out there that is objective and separate from any one of us, we can each of us hopefully approach it and get closer to it and reason together with each other about it, so that the question is one of truth, not of power. And that's what Lewis's book is really about. The will to power is what lies behind subjectivism.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I don't want to get into any particular film or TV adaptations of Tolkien and Lewis. We have the War of the Rohirrim anime that came out. We have the Rings of Power series. We have the original trilogy. We have the Narnia films. And Netflix is allegedly creating new Narnia films with Greta Gerwig. And I don't want to focus on any specific one, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on adapting Lewis and Tolkien in general, because a lot of people argue they shouldn't be adapted. They themselves seem to have expressed some hesitation about adaptation. And I know the Tolkien family continues to refuse to sell the rights to some of the works precisely because they don't want these things to be adapted. Do you have any thoughts on Lewis and Tolkien and whether they should be adapted and what they would have thought about all these adaptations coming out?
Yeah, good question. Lewis had very little exposure to film and TV I don't believe he ever owned a television. And I think he went to the cinema maybe a handful of times, literally just a handful, maybe 4 or 5 times maybe in his life. Didn't understand the genre terribly well, I think. He once said that there is death in the camera. Death in the camera. Because I don't think he understood the ways in which cinema, when it's done well, can be a language all of its own. A lot of people say rather, lazily, don't they? Oh, well, all the imagination is done for you by the filmmaker because you see it laid out for you rather than having to generate it for yourself in your own mind. But that's not right, because a good filmmaker speaks to your imagination just in a different way. It's like saying if you went to the theatre that you see things on the theatrical stage, well, but you're not generating them in your own mind, well, then it's not imaginative. Well, that doesn't follow at all. So I think Lewis didn't much like drama in general. He didn't go to the theatre much. And when he wrote his big book on the 16th century, it was entitled English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. He liked to read Shakespearean plays, but he didn't like to see them very often. But as it happens, Lewis had a very visual imagination and loved strong stories. And I think the Narnia books would make brilliant films if only they were done right. I think the first 3 films that were done 20 years ago, whenever it was, were terrible. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe was the least bad. Prince Caspian was a good deal worse. And then The Dawn Treader was a complete travesty, in my humble opinion. Greta Gerwig, who you just mentioned, who is now apparently under contract to do 2 Narnia adaptations for Netflix, hopefully she'll do a good deal better. I liked very much Greta Gerwig's adaptation of Little Women in 2019. I thought that was fantastic. Really, really well done. Very, very intelligent adaptation. And I've seen in an interview that Greta Gerwig has said that when she was a girl, she only ever read or reread 2 books, and they were Little Women and the Narnia Chronicles. So if she is as steeped in Narnian lore as she evidently seems to have been steeped in the world of Little Women, hopefully her adaptations will be much better than the ones I've just talked about. I prefer, to be honest, the BBC television adaptations. They, for all that they now look terribly clunky and old-fashioned, I think they did a bit better in capturing some of the qualities of Lewis's world. Part of the problem with those Narnia films is that they came in the wake of the Lord of the Rings movies. And because the Lord of the Rings have been so fantastically successful, I think Andrew Adamson and the other people who made those Narnia movies thought, oh, well, the closer we can make Narnia approximate to Middle-earth, the better we'll do. Not seeing that Narnia is a very different kind of world from Middle-earth. You can't just sort of lump the 2 worlds together in some sort of generic fantasy realm and say, what passes for one will pass for the other. It doesn't work like that. The Lord of the Rings movies, the three Jackson movies, Tolkien, I'm sure, would not have liked them. Christopher Tolkien hated them. I myself tend to think that they were pretty good on the whole. There are, significant problems here and there, but overall, they're masterpieces, I think, of filmmaking. When you think of all the ways they could have gone wrong, the fact that Jackson got it sort of 85% right is amazing. I love the Lord of the Rings movies. I think they're great. And they have enriched my reading of the books, which I think is the real crucial test of a film adaptation. The Hobbit movies, let's pass over those in silence.
Agreed.
And I can't speak to the Rings of Power and the War of the Rohirrim because I haven't seen those.
Well, yeah. We're butting up against our time here, but I have one kind of last question. We've touched on imagination over and over again, and you said part of your dissertation was looking at imagination in these figures. And I was wondering if you could maybe just talk about imagination as imagination and what it is for Lewis and Tolkien. I know there's this Coleridge background there as well. There's all these conversations going on about what is the faculty of imagination. Could you maybe talk a bit about that and what imagination is in Lewis and Tolkien?
Yeah, well, in Lewis, imagination is defined as the organ of meaning. A fairly simple and capacious definition, the organ of meaning. And this is defined in an essay Lewis wrote called Bluspels and Flalanspheres, which is all about metaphor and how metaphors are constructed. And in addition to defining imagination as the organ of meaning, he defines reason as the natural organ of truth. So for Lewis, imagination might, as it were, bear upon questions of truth, but you couldn't, through the exercise of imagination alone, know whether the thing was true or false, because imagination is just the organ of meaning. And before things can be either true or false, they must mean. Meaning, Lewis says, is the antecedent condition of both truth and falsehood. The opposite of which is nonsense, is meaninglessness. So imagination, as it were, distinguishes between the meaningful and the meaningless, between the nonsensical and that of which can be made sense of. That's it. That's all imagination does. It tells us that something is meaningful, but it doesn't tell us whether it's true or false. For that, you have to supply the meaningful findings provided by imagination to the higher court of reason, and then reason will adjudicate and say that meaning is true and that meaning is false. So think of it in terms of, someone lies to you. They say a statement which means something, but it is untrue. Your imagination is what tells you that it is a meaningful statement. Your reason is what tells you that it is a lie. So reason for Lewis depends upon imagination. You can never do any work of ratiocination without a prior work of imagination. And that's important because it speaks to a cultural misapprehension, which I think plagues a lot of people's attitudes to the world, that they tend to think that reason is somehow divorced from imagination. That you just be reasonable, think it through clearly and logically, and then you'll come to the right conclusion. Well, yeah, but all depends on what it is you're reasoning about, and it's imagination's job to provide you with things to reason about. So everything that we ever do in our rational inquiries and investigations is fundamentally, foundationally imaginative. So it's not a question that over here we have the rational scientists and mathematicians who are thinking clearly and dispassionately about the world, and over here we have the imaginative artists, the storytellers and the dreamy types who might be terribly warm-hearted, but they're not very clear-headed. That's not how reason and imagination are related in Lewis's scheme. They're related like this. Imagination supports reason, and reason rests upon imagination. If you take imagination away, reason has nothing to reason about. It's just left dangling in midair. So scientists and mathematicians typically find meaningful quantities. That's the basis of science, mathematics, and the basis of mathematics is quantity. That you quantify a little bit of reality according to various measurements, whatever they may be, in terms of weight or height or distance or speed or whatever it might be, and you put those quantities into equations, and then you draw your conclusions. And God bless you. Lewis has got nothing against science. It's just that the meaningful language of science is a language which is very univocal. It's very plain, you might say, because there's no room really for mistranslation. 2 plus 2 equals 4 in all languages of the world. For Japanese and Australian and Englishmen, they all come to the same conclusion. There's nothing lost in translation with mathematics. Lewis describes maths as the type of successful thought. But of course, quantities are very small kinds of linguistic units. They don't admit us to much about the nature of human experience. For that, you need to go to the poets and the playwrights and the dramatists and the filmmakers and the musicians for languages that can find meaning in quality, not just quantity, but quality and personality and purpose and interrelationship and all those much more nebulous things, which are much deeper and richer and truer to our experience, but much harder to quantify by definition. But that doesn't mean they're any less rational. It just means that the reasoning that we bring to those meaningful things has to be done in a slightly different way. And so a great novel, a great play, a great film is not necessarily irrational or non-rational or less rational than E equals mc squared. It's just reasoning about differently meaningful things. So we shouldn't think of science and the humanities as opposed to each other like that. That's not how they're related. They are both, when they're done properly, rational and imaginative. They just reason about different kinds of meaningful things. So that's a brief overview of Lewis on imagination and reason. And I think Tolkien would have more or less subscribed to that scheme. He writes about these topics much less than Lewis, as far as I'm aware. But there are one or two things in Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, for instance, which lead me to think that he would be pretty much signed up with that and understanding of the state of affairs. But I submit that to real Tolkien scholars.
Thank you so much. One last question. If people are wanting to find out more about you and your work, where would you direct them?
I have a website called michaelward.net. michaelward.net. And I'm also on Facebook. My two main books, which we've talked about, After Humanity and Planet Narnia, are available at all good booksellers. I've also recently made a foray into film criticism. We didn't have a chance to get into that, but I co-wrote a book called Popcorn with the Pope, which I suppose brings back full circle to questions of Catholicism and film adaptation. People might like to check out that. It's a guide to the Vatican film list, a list that was put out to mark the centenary of cinema in 1995. It was great fun writing that guide with two friends. So that's a third book that people might like to check out.
So what'd you think, John?
I loved it. This is one of my favorite. Sometimes when we're interviewing people, I'm just sort of drifting out. But in this one,
90%
I was
of the time.
Lewis and Tolkien. I love it. I love it. I loved this talk, and I loved all of the knowledge he brought to it. So cool.
Yeah, you see why I wanted to have him on the show. I knew him actually from back in the Oxford days. He was basically the guy who made the C.S. Lewis Society their run. And just getting to know him through that's pretty awesome. His knowledge of C.S. Lewis is just endless. And he's also now branched off into Tolkien stuff. It's kind of natural, obviously, that the two were inseparable and big influences on one another.
Yeah. Well, and I hope, I'm very excited. I know we touched briefly on the films and TV stuff, but I am so excited to see what Greta Gerwig does with the Narnia movies. I'm heard nervous. She might be doing not Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but Magician's Nephew, and all of the beginning of everything and time hopping and all of those. Wouldn't that be amazing?
I'm super, super nervous.
Why? Yeah. She's legit. She did Little Woman in a way that honored the original source material, but also updated it for a contemporary audience and fixed some of the uncomfortable things about it. I'm nervous only because I'm so excited, but I have as much faith in her as I would have in anyone.
Well, it's just this idea of modernizing and making. Well, it's with Little Women, no one is sort of like trapped within the cosmos or the world of that story in the same way Tolkien or Lewis fans are with Narnia and Middle Earth. You know what I'm saying? And so translating that into film always it just makes me so nervous. Pulling off what Peter Jackson was able to do with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it's just so stinking difficult. It's nothing against her. It's just it's a difficult task. How many times have people tried and failed and it just doesn't quite work?
Yeah, no, I get that.
It just makes me nervous. I think it's justifiable nervousness. We went and saw War of the Rohirrim recently together, and I mean, we both kind of walked away with the same feeling that it didn't quite capture it the same way, even though it's the same studio. It didn't quite capture the Lord of the Rings universe in the same way. They took some creative liberties, and not for the best.
Yeah, if those liberties had paid off, I would have been like, okay, I'm not like a deep canonical purist where you can't in any way connect the dots between what Tolkien's doing to come up with a side thing. I'm not against that, but they were doing it in a way that was so obvious, just didn't work. So
yeah, I had not. I told this to you. I had not read that part of the lore of Middle Earth, where the lore of the War of the Rohirrim was coming from, and I was after the film able to pick out the parts that were not in the original Tolkien lore,
just from what was good and what wasn't good.
Yeah, and the reason it wasn't good is not because like if it weren't if it were in another film, it would have been fine. The problem is when you take creative liberties, it has to feel Tolkien-esque, and that's the thing, or Lewis-esque. And that's the thing when it comes to these adaptations, is there's such a deep world that you can't take creative liberties as freely as you can in something like Little Women.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Little Women, I thought she did a great job with making it a legitimate connection. But I will defend Greta Gerwig to the death. So let's get off that hill. But
I will say I liked Lady Bird. Did she do Lady Bird?
Yeah, she did.
That was a good movie.
But I think that with the War of the Rohirrim, the stuff that doesn't work is the stuff that just sounds like modern cliches put back into Tolkien. It was like in The Hobbit at the end of the Battle of the Five Armies, when the female elf is mourning the death of the Hobbit she fell in love with, and she says, "It hurts so much," and then the Elf King goes, "That's how you know it was real." And I'm like, no, Tolkien would never have said that. That sounds so much like someone in 2015, like giving you advice over Twitter, like, man, your pain sucks, bro, but that's how you know it was real. And it was like, oh God.
My favorite meme out of that is that line. It's why does it hurt so much? And then the elf replies, because it's in the script. I don't know why it made me laugh.
Because it's in the script. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm nervous. I think the Rings of Power, I think has done. I know that's a controversial topic, as well. They've done an okay job.
Tolkien purists have hated it. The less into the universe you are, it feels like. Generally, I know you might be an exception. Generally, the more into the universe you are, I've noticed the less they like it. Because they see the differences and kind of that. They feel like it's not Tolkien-esque. It's not Middle Earth.
So I get why they hate it, because it's like you're saying stuff Tolkien didn't say. But it's weird because The Rings of Power was written by and almost for Tolkien nerds. It is connecting dots that you wouldn't have any idea existed there to be connected unless you were deep in the lore. And like they're not making it for a big popular level audience in that way. They're like, these guys who are making it are nerds, and they are mining the Tolkien canon for every little detail. And so like in that sense,
but they're changing a lot.
It is very Tolkien-esque, and I actually think the changes they make a lot of sense. But if you don't like anything deviating from the canon, then I get it. But I've argued this before. I don't think Tolkien's universe is his property because Tolkien describes his universe as something he's discovering, not something he's inventing. And in that sense, if you actually get on board with that image, of him encountering this universe, we also can encounter it, and we don't have to go through him to encounter it.
But that's the problem. It feels like that makes it even more ossified. If he's discovering it, then the things he's discovered, you can't just go back and say, "Oh, we're going to pretend that's different," right? It's kind of like somebody going into Africa. And it's like, "Hey, I'm not inventing the creatures I'm telling you I found. There are elephants and there are gorillas and stuff." And then someone else comes along and says, "Let's put dragons and dinosaurs in there." You know what I'm saying? It's not Africa anymore.
Yeah, so I think it means that you can legitimately find stuff in that universe that Tolkien didn't find. But it has to be stuff that makes sense in that universe and actually would be in that universe. And the accountability for that is not Tolkien, it's a different source. So I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, but it's kind of like, let me use a scriptural metaphor. If Tolkien is to Middle Earth what the Bible is to God, you can't go, if Tolkien is truly discovering this, as he's saying, let's just go with that for a bit. Then, in the same way the Bible reveals to us God, and trying to go around and pretend and do something different from that revelation, it's gonna be less than. It's gonna be an error. It's not gonna be the truth.
Well,
And in the
what's
same way, if
interesting
Tolkien
Yeah.
is like this revelation of Middle Earth, he is our access to it.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe change the subject before I question the canon, not just of Tolkien, but of Christianity, because then
Of course you would.
Then we're no.
Your love of the Rings of Power outweighs your love of God.
Wait, those are separate things? Those aren't the same thing?
But don't even. We've already had one bad joke. One of the things that I wanted to pick out was the impact of them on each other. And one of the figures that he kind of brought up once, real briefly, was Owen Barfield. And Owen Barfield has been a fascinating figure to me. He's been an absolutely fascinating figure to me because he's one of the Inklings. Like, obviously, Lewis and Tolkien, when we think about the Inklings, those are the first two people we think of. But there was a lot of other members of the Inklings. There was Charles Williams, and obviously now Owen Barfield. Barfield wrote a lot in his own right, and he was considered the first and the last Inkling. He was the last to die, first to be born and the last to die. He was a very old man. And his impact on Lewis and Tolkien was phenomenal as well. Because, like, when it came to, like, the argument from reason, which Lewis has in one of his books, that originally was from Barfield. When it came to a lot of this idea about meaning making and imagination, a lot of that they actually took from Barfield. It's just real fascinating to me that in order to understand one of these figures, you nearly need to understand all of these figures.
Well, because they're doing spiritual friendship and literary friendship in a way that's so foreign to today, that would almost be sexualized today, which is interesting because, the intimacy between the hobbits, Frodo and Sam, was constantly turned into a bunch of gay jokes because men can't be intimate with each other without it being something
Sexual.
that we laugh about or sexualize. But Tolkien, and Lewis, they're part of this spiritual friendship. And Tolkien had close friendships like that even before Lewis. Growing up as a kid, he used to write poetry, and he was in sort of a literary group in school. And almost all of those people died in World War I, right? And so he knew what spiritual friendship and literary friendship could be, and yet he also lost it, and is trying to find it again, and yet knows it can never be replaced. And so, like, they're working and bouncing off each other in a way that's so foreign to a lot of the way that we think about friendship today.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, it's nearly like you can't have that sort of friendship anymore. And what's interesting is you hear some of the ways they interacted, and it doesn't sound very friendly. So Professor Ward pointed out that it was Lewis who really pushed Lord of the Rings out the door. But on the other side, Tolkien did not like did not like Narnia. Tolkien did not like Narnia.
Yeah, it's you don't have to just be unconditionally supportive. There's more accountability and, hey, buddy, I love you, but this sucks, or get off your butt and get to work. Like there's less of we're just here pushing you on, and more of no, we'll slap you down if you need it.
Yeah. And,
So
and what's real funny to me is he actually did like C.S. Lewis's brother, Warney, who no one ever talks about. Warney, he actually did like his writing, but he didn't like C.S. Lewis,
you
which
didn't
is
like
just
seeing it.
hilarious to me because
Sorry, Clive.
it's like he'd invented this real unique universe. Tolkien invented this big giant universe with like all these different characters, and it was everything was really deep and meaningful and stuff. And then Lewis comes along, and it's like, so Santa Claus comes along, and it's just
Well,
like pulling things from
yeah.
like all these different mythologies and just jamming them together.
Oh gosh, and I love it because sometimes modern audiences roll their eyes when Santa Claus comes up in Chronicles of Narnia, and you can't imagine how much greater the eye roll of Tolkien would have probably been.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
But
can you
Tolkien
imagine?
loves Santa Claus. There's a whole book of Tolkien's letters to his children that he writes as Santa, writing to them from the North Pole. But he wouldn't have
Oh,
put
that's next
Santa
level.
Claus in the Middle Earth, right? So.
Yeah.
But so you mentioned Owen Barfield and his relationship in the Inklings with them, and Owen Barfield has a lot of theosophical and anthroposophical
Anthroposophy.
backgrounds,
Yeah.
and we did a recent episode on this on spiritual but not religious and the history of those movements. Go check that out if you haven't had a chance to. But could you maybe go into a bit of the Barfield stuff, Seth,
Check
for
that
us?
out if I can. Yeah, so the Barfield stuff. So basically, Barfield did some studies, discovered a love for Rudolf Steiner, who is the founder of the Anthroposophical Society, which we talked about in that episode. And basically, he ended up Christianizing it even further. He took the parts of Steiner and Christianized it, put it into a whole history. Kind of understood the entire history of through a lens of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness, and Christ at the center of this evolution of consciousness. And it's a really fascinating idea, whether you agree with it or not. It's really, really stinking interesting. And there's a recent book written, The Secret History of Christianity, that kind of tries to update this. So go check that out. I'm not saying I agree with all of it, but that's a sort of up-to-date version of Barfield's ideas. And then you see some of these ideas filter into Tolkien and Lewis. Most specifically, there's actually a point in The Abolition of Man, which we talked about with Professor Ward, where Lewis talks about Rudolf Steiner glowingly, as if he's like some future, maybe the future of science will, kind of in some sense look to him as a harbinger of what it might be in the future. And so, I mean, it's just a sort of passing reference, and yet it's there. And yet we know that's a very interesting hint at the impact of Barfield on the thought of Lewis. And there's other examples that aren't quite so overt, but it's scattered throughout.
All right, so New Age Tolkien, New Age Lewis. That's got to be an episode.
Yeah, I mean, considering how much of our audience love those figures, I feel like we're going to get a lot of mileage out of this. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus a chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I, suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom-made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.